I want to say first how pleased I am to be here. Some of you know I've been to Denmark many times. Most of the times I've been here either working with students from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, but here in Denmark, on anthropology, ethnography. And I remember most those wonderful mornings when I would spend with the students, and then in the afternoon they would meet separately and I would go off biking. So that was a very wonderful memory. And then I've also been here working with refugee young people and what we call in many parts of the world street children, street youth, and working here in many cases. And situations where I've come from Sweden and then been in Denmark for a while. So Charlotte and I were just talking about the fact that when you have been in a language for quite a while, you can understand, and I never claimed to speak any Danish, but to understand a good bit of it. But when you leave it, and you go away, and I haven't been back to Denmark for quite a few years, except on a biking trip, you forget. You can't bring it back until you're in a context like this, where you pretty much know what people are talking about, so you can cling to certain words and ideas and then begin to get it back again. And so Charlotte and I were talking about the fact that we often lament our forgetting of a language if we don't use it. And I said, well, that's a good way for me to start talking this morning, because I need to introduce myself a bit, and then you'll see why I use the language example. I'm a combination of a linguist and an anthropologist, but I've been a teacher most of my life. So what I've always been focused on is how does learning happen, and particularly how does it happen for the most reluctant learners, those who've had very little schooling, or they've had bad experiences with schooling, or they've had many incursions in their lives, or many difficulties in their lives that make them not eager to learn. So what I've done is study what is the magical formula that all of us as teachers look for that will make my learners want to learn and make them remember. And so over the years, both through my research as an anthropologist studying behaviors and how people speak and write and read, I came to realize that I needed to know more. And what I needed to know was, as Charlotte and I were saying, what is it that goes on in their heads? How many times have you wanted to know what's happening in their head? So a number of years ago, I decided to take several years to study neuroscience and neurology. And so I took those years off in an interdisciplinary research center at Stanford University, where I teach, and learned a little bit about neuroscience. And I keep learning because I'm the chief science advisor now for a big learning center through our National Science Foundation. So I want to try this morning and this afternoon in talking about things like resilience and relationships and the ways in which ideas resonate or move through young people's lives. I want to talk a bit about what I've learned by putting together observing behavior, as we all do as teachers, and then working with some of the most astonishing equipment in the world to know also what's going on inside the head, what's happening in the brain. And I felt I really needed to go there in order to back up some of my hunches. And no surprise to you, I'm sure, some of my hunches very early were that learning in and with the arts, regardless of the mode, whether it's dance or visual arts or theater, that learning was doing very different things in the brain than I could do, no matter how good a teacher I was, and whatever level. When I was using the arts, something different was happening. So, as in many countries of the world, you would know this probably as well, if not better than I, the question has, in the last 10, 15 years, as nations have competed more and more for how good are you at education, the question has come often. Why don't we get rid of all the arts and instead focus on mathematics and science and social studies and language? And maybe a few other things. But so I've been saying, wait, stop. There are some things you need to know if you're going to do that. And one of the first things is something that came up in my conversation with Charlotte. And that is that what we have learned in the last 2 to 3 years is that of our 300 billion connections, more or less, in the brain, only about 30% of those get dedicated to what we do in teaching, which is, for the most part, what we do. We focus on the cognitive. I want you to learn about this. I want you to think about the concepts. I want you to understand the principles. That's all cognitive, or the linguistic. So that's about all we've got, is how to ask someone to express what they are learning through the way they're using the cognitive. The other part of the brain, of our connections, about 70%, will be dedicated to what we call the locomotor. What I'm doing now, talking, moving my jaw, moving my hands, moving my body, running, biking, drawing, acting, dancing, where you're using so much more, and it takes a great deal of knowledge and skill, and as Charlotte and I were saying, practice to be able to do those locomotive habits, to keep them up. So what happens often when we're rushing through the cognitive is that we forget the need for locomotive practice. And much of that practice is possible only through the varieties of arts, because the arts are about the most deeply principled, deeply cognitive knowledge we have. But the irony is that we learn and move that through what we do with our physical movement. Now I want to show you just a couple of slides. Remember resiliency, resonance, and relationships. I'll come back to those. You might be thinking of what they are in Danish. I wouldn't dare attempt to pronounce them. But what I've said is, all of this, why it is that watching and thinking, drawing, molding with clay, making, all of these, why is it that it actually changes the brain? And you may say, wait a minute, Shirley. I don't believe for a minute when we are doing art that our brain is changing. Others may say, yes, yes, it is. So the issue is that we've really not been able to prove that until lately. Now this slide should, at the same time that you are puzzling over it, it should thrill you, because we just got this result in the last few months. The top slide is that of individuals. It's an amalgamation of individuals who have been sustaining, working with a lot of practice in one or another of the arts, and in this case, primarily music. We get a very similar pattern with the other arts. This one happens to be music. The B slide, the middle slide, is of those brains which are like all of us would be if we hadn't done arts in much of our lives. They're very normal. They're highly accomplished individuals. But what you see immediately is much more, this happens to be a measure of blood flow activity and changes. Now, one of the things we've known in the past is that when these changes in the ways the parts of the brain, the wiring, the dendrites we call it, the little threads like the things we clean our teeth with, except much smaller, when those get to moving certain ways, they don't change. They keep it up and they do more with practice. Without practice, it's like Charlotte and Shirley. We lose that language ability. We lose the ability to speak, to move, to know the gesture, to know what to do with the G. Since I've been in Denmark this time, I keep thinking, okay, what's the rule about how to pronounce G? Where is it in the throat? Or is it not in the throat here as it is in German or in Swedish? Now, the bottom, the C is a very interesting slide. That is not an adult. That is, in contrast, imagine that you're seeing that with no red. That would be the child who's had no art. This is a child who's begun, again amalgamated, several children, who've begun working regularly in the arts. Now you may say, well, does that really matter? You're talking about blood flow, I teach, and I ask those questions a lot when I started out. But the reason it matters is because of something that matters to all of us a great deal as teachers. And executive function, or EF as it always gets pronounced in English, for short, has been thrown around a lot with the arts, but only with the latest technology have we been able to see what happens with executive function. Now, all we mean by executive function is what we intuitively do every day as good teachers, which is we want to say to our students, I want you to think as we're going through this lesson about how you're going to plan what you know and what you can do next. Certainly if we're working with refugee children, or in my case with street children, children in New York and St. Louis and Chicago who live on the street much of their time, I'm always talking about how are you planning? You've got to think about where you're going to be the next night. You've got to think about what you're carrying your few possessions in. We talk about planning. We talk about self-control. We want you not to misbehave on the subway if you're a young person of color in tattered clothes in America or in England. we are always, as teachers, talking about planning and self-control. That's what happens with executive function. And when it happens in the brain, it happens in those areas. It's primarily in the front, and it is in the motor section, if we're right-handed, here, and also in the language section when you're actually saying to yourself, here's what I'm planning for dinner. Here's what I'm planning about the next lesson. And it turns out that obviously these abilities and these brain flow sections in the brain are very strongly correlated with academic achievement. So I often say to the neurologist, you're telling me if I can get these young people to have more brain flow, more blood flow in the brain, more brain flow wouldn't hurt either, then they're going to be better academically. And they look at me, yes. But then they're not about to tell us as teachers how to do that. But one of the things they do realize is that that's what we care about. So then a number of interdisciplinary teams have begun to put together measures of intelligence. Now, most of us don't trust those much, with the ability to show this executive function through brain connections. And it turns out that for children who are showing that they've had some participation on a sustained basis in the arts, we can better predict how they're going to achieve academically in mathematics and in language, particularly any kind of reading and interpretation skills, than we can with intelligence. That's assuming, of course, that they're pretty neurologically normal, that they haven't had a brain trauma to the, or they haven't really drugged themselves out of normal brain activity. And so the other thing that we often, most of us, I suspect, because you care about the arts, you really want your young people to be flexible cognitively, to be able to deal with you if they think they're going to come in on Tuesday morning and do one thing, and they come in on Tuesday, and you've moved over here, and you're doing something else. And what you want them to do is to figure out, without your telling them, the connection between what you did over here and what you're doing over here. And to realize, oh, I know why you did that, to get the principles behind it, to see into your thinking so that they say, my teacher is asking me to be very flexible in my thinking. The other word for that gets thrown in the newspapers all the time is creativity. I mean, everybody wants creativity, but the creativity can only come if you are cognitively flexible. If you simply take in information and you don't question it, move it around, and do all the things I hope we're going to do through the day, just as Elizabeth introduced us to the possibilities here at Louisiana, we're going to be cognitively flexible. We're going to think about, how can I use that? What might I do with that? Well, how would that fit in my art class as I'm working with a science teacher who's working on climate or who's working on erosion, etc. So not many of you, I suspect, are working with very young children, but I thought it would be useful to you to have some sense of the developmental power of working in the arts. And I suspect if you wrote your biography, each of you, in working in the arts or in working with young people as you've seen them change through the arts, if that were to happen, you would say, yes, I can be cognitively flexible today in my teaching. I know I am. That's why I'm such a good teacher. Because I started cutting with scissors. I've spent a number of hours since I've been in Denmark this time watching children here cut with scissors. We don't do that anymore in the States. It's impossible to find a small pair of scissors for children. We've cut it out because they're all doing this instead of this. Well, I'll talk more this afternoon about why this turns out to be so vital to the brain. And we say, it's such a simple thing. Why is it so vital? Well, it goes back about 30,000 years. The other issue is that if you worked in the arts when you were young, you not only developed habits of cognitive flexibility, often called, you're stubborn. You're the most stubborn little boy I've ever known. How many of you have had your grandparents or relatives say that to you and you remember? Yes. But that was because I didn't want to do what people told me to do. I wanted to do it a different way. I wanted to do things differently. I had cognitive flexibility. I had a lot of memory. I had a lot of working memory. I could put things in my head and play with them. And it turns out that if in early childhood you've had a lot of arts, those three things, working memory, the ability to plan, and you say, wait a minute, the ability to plan, what does that mean? And we all know what that means. Well, it turns out that what it means, and I won't have time to talk much about this, but what it actually means is the ability to use the visual section of the brain, which is in the back, contrary to intuition, is in the back of the brain, to use that visual memory to look ahead as you plan. Now, most of us will say, if someone says, okay, let's meet at such and such a place at 7:15, what time will you be leaving your house? You envision, you get a picture, quite literally in your brain, of what the traffic is going to be like at that hour, what time you would have to leave at that hour as opposed to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So you see it. So you can see immediately why cutting with scissors, drawing, doing very fine work with a glue gun, as I've seen children do here in the astonishing children's area, that is all about planning. It's about envisioning what's going to happen. So these go on, not only, we hope, very much sticking through adolescence. For those of us who work with adolescents, my watch broke after I got here, so I'm watching the time. We want it to go on through adolescence. But as we go forward today, I want you to think about is, yes, that's a given. We all have that. But do all of our students have it? Those of us who work with refugees, who work with very young children, children who've been from a very young age on the streets, in my case, or those who are now going into higher secondary education, into gymnasium. Well, those are often not the most willing learners for cognitive subject matters that we think are important for them to go on to further education. So it is this whole thing with very young children to have a sense of curiosity, which is often what calls us stubborn. I took 2 little boys recently who were 9 years old to a cranberry bog. Cranberries in the States are grown in very low areas that are scooped out, and the bushes grow and they're watered regularly, and then when they want to harvest the cranberries, they flood them and then go in with these special wooden rakers to rake the cranberries off the water and harvest them. But one of the little boys was happy to go on with me when I got ready to leave. The other little boy, I thought I was never going to get the kid out of the ditch along the cranberry bog, because he was finding this piece of nature and this frog and this insect and this bug. His curiosity was uncontrollable. And I kept saying, it's getting dark, we have to go. But it is this ability to have the curiosity, the fascination, and then that movement of thought. And then what I want to do this afternoon is to sort of start us here and thinking about, well, what happens with those of us who work with adolescents? Because I know many of you are working in higher secondary education. And it's very easy to do as I did when I started working in the neuroscience 10, 15 years ago, is to imagine that if those changes haven't come when they're young, what can I do as a teacher? And the issue is that it is the case that we can enable, through the arts, catch up. We can, but it has to be very sustained. And that sustainment for adolescents is most easily managed in a variety of ways of managing projects and collaborative projects. And I want to talk more this afternoon about focusing on adolescents of all sorts through this. So we'll start with this afternoon in terms of what this actually means. What I'd like to do now is to see, for just a few minutes, catch up in terms of questions you may have that hit you, things you want to go back to get a sense of whether I'm hitting the right points here to move forward, or things that really matter to you. That would help me a lot if people would either out in the group or at break or whatever, think about what is it that I'm having trouble linking all of this to the central question. I wrote to myself, I always write a one-page note, talk about planning ahead and vision, is, are there any truly convincing arguments that working in the arts matters? Yes?
Well, I'm asking myself, what about the arts? Because you were talking about moving, understand that very, very well, and I've been here with a class, and we have been moving, and we tried to move the water, and then we were stopped. But anyway, so moving, that's not the same thing as looking at a piece of art, or perhaps playing the piano or something. Would you please?
Any kind of movement. Charlotte and I were talking about talking. She said she knew Thai, but once she got into, 3 years later, a group of Thai speakers, she could move her mouth in the right way. She could, move. So any kind of movement that enables the forearm and the hand in particular, but observing, your point about observing is critical. It is looking. What do you take in when you do this, a panoramic view? And they're all familiar with that from their cameras on their phones. And what are you taking in if you only do a view between 15 degrees and 20 degrees? Okay. So it is this imagining, but they're thinking with movement. And I know when I used to teach mathematics, before I learned about movement, I thought the movement was in the head with the problems. Well, we've got a problem set. Let's do the problem set. That's not involving movement in relationship to those concepts. So it is any kind of movement, but particularly those kinds of movement that require practice. And all of us know that one of the most important practices we have working in the arts is that of observing. And then taking that in and taking the next step, which is compare it and contrast it. Compare it and contrast it. What's the difference between what you're going to see in Riverbed and the pictures you've seen of Victoria Falls? And you say, well, for starters, size, location. Well, what else? What else? What else? And it's that cognitive flexibility that you want people to think quickly, of course, about all the differences. Great point.
Can I say something?
Yes, yes.
Take your hands here and do this. First time, easy. Do it again, but go up on toes. Okay. Difficult? No. Try with closed eyes.
Aha.
The same movement.
Much harder.
That's example with the side and your balanced organs and your
Exactly.
moves. That's one point. You can use your body to activate your side.
Absolutely.
That's a, what called erkendelse, hvad hedder det?
Recognition. Mhm.
Yes. Could you go backwards? So when you use your side, you activate the body.
Right. And in the States now, it's very popular for people to walk backwards. That is an exercise that they're using. And one of the cautions I've made about that for young children is that it's much better for them to go forward and then think about the difference when you're walking backwards. And walking backwards requires a very different set, goes back to your question, a different set of motor images. Now, the other thing, an exercise that when I didn't realize the group was going to be so large that I thought about doing was that if I had given you all very soft, small items and asked you to close your eyes so that you didn't see them and asked you to sketch those simply by feeling, and then, in comparison, ask you to open your eyes and sketch them. The difference is, in most cases, not all, in most cases, that you are more accurate by feeling than you are by seeing. And that was so hard for me to understand until I began to understand what you were demonstrating, this issue of the relationship between internally seeing and the motor control. And we are much better at that than we are at simply seeing and linking motor control, when what we want is very precise accuracy and speed, certainly not in the long term. Last question, and then I'll turn it back over to Elizabeth. Anyone else have a point or an exercise? Great, well, we'll have more time together. Thank you, and collect your questions. Collect them, and then we'll go back to them. Great.